In our headlines on this Tuesday, April 7th, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung hosts the leaders of the country's rival political parties for trilateral talks aimed at addressing the escalating cost of living for Koreans amid the unrest in the Middle East. And speaking of that unrest, U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday claims Iran can be, quote, taken out in one night, and that night might be Tuesday night if Tehran fails to seal a deal that is, quote, acceptable to him. Back on the local front, Samsung Electronics is projecting an operating profit of over 57 trillion won, or roughly $38 billion for the first quarter of this year, driven by strong demand for artificial intelligence chips. As we count down fewer than 24 hours to his deadline on Tehran, U.S. President Donald Trump has reaffirmed his resolve to unleash havoc on critical infrastructure in Iran should the country fail to ensure safe transit to all vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. He also singled out American allies, including South Korea, for their alleged lack of support. Our Kim Jun-hong has the latest.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday issued an ultimatum to Iran, saying all power plants and bridges would be destroyed unless the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, and the deal aimed at ending the 5-week conflict is agreed. Speaking to reporters at the White House on Monday, Trump said he was not at all concerned that such action could amount to war crimes, and that he had already given Tehran enough extensions, and the Tuesday 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time deadline is final.
But we're giving them till tomorrow, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and after that, they're going to have no bridges, they're going to have no power plants.
Trump went on to say that total destruction would be carried out by midnight, and that Iran must accept the deal he deems acceptable, reiterating that reopening the Strait of Hormuz remains his top priority in any agreement with Tehran. The U.S. president also criticized European and Asian allies for failing to support Washington in its conflict with Iran, specifically naming South Korea. Repeating his description of NATO as a, quote, paper tiger, he said the alliance had offered little support in the war.
And it's not just NATO. You know who else didn't help us? South Korea didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Australia didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Japan.
He wrapped up his press conference with renewed frustration over the lack of response to last month's call for naval deployments to the Strait of Hormuz. Trump pointed to what he said is 45,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, though the actual figure is closer to 28,000. He stressed that their deployment was to offer protection against nuclear-armed North Korea. Kim Jun-hong, Arirang News.
Iran, meanwhile, has dismissed a proposal by Pakistan for a temporary truce, demanding instead for a permanent end to the military confrontation, among other conditions. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
Iran has rejected a 45-day temporary ceasefire plan delivered to both Washington and Tehran by regional intermediaries, calling instead for a permanent end to the conflict. According to Iran state news agency IRNA on Monday, Tehran has instead submitted a 10-point response via Pakistan, rejecting a temporary ceasefire and outlining demands including an end to regional conflicts, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, reconstruction of war-damaged areas, and the lifting of international sanctions. U.S. President Donald Trump described Iran's proposal as a significant step, but said it was not good enough, warning of sweeping strikes on Iranian infrastructure if no deal is reached. Iran on Monday dismissed the threats as baseless.
The rude rhetoric, arrogance and baseless threats of the delusional U.S. president arising from the deadlock he faces and aimed at justifying the repeated defeats of the U.S. military will have no effect on the continuation of offensive and crushing operations by the fighters of Islam against U.S. and Israeli enemies.
The exchange follows reports that Washington sent a 15-point peace plan proposal through Pakistan in late March, which Iran rejected as unrealistic and disconnected from battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, tensions escalated on the ground. Iran confirmed the death of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' intelligence chief, Majid Kademi, in an overnight strike blamed on U.S. and Israeli forces. Israel later confirmed responsibility, with Defense Minister Israel Katz calling Kademi a top commander responsible for war crimes. The Israel Defense Forces said he was among the IRGC's most senior figures, underscoring a widening conflict with no clear path to de-escalation. 이승재, Arirang News.
Here on the local front, President Lee Jae-myung has called on rival political parties to put aside their differences as South Korea seeks to protect the livelihoods of people here from the costly consequences of the conflict in the Middle East. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min has more.
The three-way meeting began with handshakes. President Lee Jae-myung, wearing a tie representing unity, called for across-the-aisle cooperation as he hosted the leaders of the nation's two main political parties over lunch, stressing the importance of communication.
우리 공동체가 위기에 처해 있을 때는 내부적 단합이 정말로 중요합니다. 우리가 통상적으로 얘기하는 것처럼 통합이라고 하는 것이 정말 이럴 때 빛을 발하지 않을까 싶습니다.
Higher living costs topped Tuesday's meeting as the country navigates the fallout from the war in the Middle East. Lee said he expects dialogue and coordination across the aisle for the war response supplementary budget worth 26 trillion won or $17 billion, which includes cash assistance for the bottom 70% of the income bracket.
근데 이런 거는 현찰 나눠주기라고 하는 것은 좀 과한 표현이라는 생각이 들어요. 지금 유류대 인상 또 그로 인해 파생되는 물가 상승이 워낙 크기 때문에 그로 인한 고통을 조금이라도 우리가 보전해 드려야 된다는 생각을 가지고 있습니다.
As the president reiterated that the government's extra budget was organized with surplus tax revenues, the ruling Democratic Party leader Chung Cheong-nae asked for support for its swift approval.
We should not miss this critical point for people's livelihoods. If it gets delayed, the damage will be greater. I have repeatedly promised to pass the extra budget as quickly as possible. I ask for cooperation from the opposition.
But the main opposition People Power Party leader Chang Dong-hyuk disagreed with certain spending plans.
Our party plans to cut unnecessary and inadequate spending. Instead, we have proposed 7 items that are seen as essential for people to survive. I hope these are reflected in the budget. I believe that will be the start of cooperation.
Chang was also critical of the government's policies in a host of areas, ranging from the economy, real estate to foreign policy, and asked that the president change his course of state affairs.
다소 불편한 말씀을 길게 드렸지만 들어주셔서 감사합니다.
전혀 안 불편합니다.
The meeting took place at a time when politicians are standing apart on certain issues, such as a special probe into what the DP calls politically motivated indictments under the previous conservative administration. The three-way meeting was the first of its kind in about 7 months, as a scheduled lunch meeting in February was abruptly canceled as the PPP leader protested the DP-led judicial reform laws. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, over at the Parliament, the Special Committee on Budget and Accounts convened on this Tuesday for the first of a 2-day Q&A session on the government's proposal for a supplementary budget of over 26 trillion won to weather the broader economic consequences of the conflict in the Middle East. The ruling Democratic Party called the proposal urgently necessary, while the main opposition People Power Party referred to parts of the proposal as vote buying ahead of the local elections this June. Budget Minister Park Hong-keun, for his part, urged for prompt action, warning that delays would only aggravate hardships. A subcommittee review is set for Thursday and a full floor vote is scheduled for Friday. And the price of petrol at the pumps here in Seoul has surpassed 2,000 won per litre, prompting a stricter campaign to save energy on the roads. Our Cha Yun-kyung explains.
The average price of gasoline in Seoul has surpassed 2,000 won, or $1.32 per liter, due to the effects of the ongoing war in the Middle East. According to OPNet, a fuel price monitoring system operated by the state-run Korea National Oil Corporation. The average stood at 2,001.54 won per liter as of 2:30 p.m. Tuesday, up 11.15 won from the previous day. It's the first time in 3 years and 8 months that the per-liter price has exceeded 2,000 won, when prices surged due to the Russia-Ukraine war. Nationwide, the average price has risen 8.54 won per liter, standing at 1,966.91 won. The South Korean government will implement a 5-day rotation system at public parking lots starting Wednesday. Entry is restricted on one day of the week based on the last digit of a car's license plate number, but it does not apply on weekends and public holidays. This is in line with government guidance following the issuance of a resource security crisis alert at the caution level as global supply disruptions continue. Public institutions that were already adopting the 5-day rotation system will be tightened further. Cars with odd number plates will be allowed to operate on odd number dates, while even number plates will run on even number dates. Electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles will be excluded, along with vehicles carrying people with disabilities or pregnant women. Violations will be subject to a 3-strike rule, with disciplinary action imposed after 3 or more violations. Cha Yoon-kyung, Arirang News.
And as expected, analysts at the state-run KDI believe the South Korean economy is now exposed to greater external risk factors given the unrest in the Middle East. Our Ian Jin covers their most recent assessment.
South Korea's economy had been showing a trend of modest recovery until it was disrupted by the ongoing Middle East war and now faces increased downside risks. This was the assessment by the Korea Development Institute in its April publication. The KDI's analysis suggests that as soaring international oil prices and supply chain instability persist, negative impacts on inflation, consumption, investment, and exports across the board could intensify. The state-run think tank first mentioned the possibility of downward economic risks from the geopolitical crisis 1 month ago and is now issuing a more explicit warning, saying the risks are expanding. Domestic demand is currently improving modestly, while exports maintain a high growth rate on the back of strong demand for semiconductors. Average retail sales for January and February increased by 2.7% compared to the same period last year, recording a higher growth rate than in December of last year, which was at 1.2%. Service industry production also increased by 3.3% during the same period. Facility investment rose by 9.3% in January and February on average, bolstered by strong investment in semiconductors. And while construction investment remains sluggish, the decline showed signs of easing. However, the KDI also analyzed that as of March, downward risks to the economy are expanding due to rising oil prices and global supply chain instability due to the Middle East war. For the month of March, the spike in prices at gas stations drove consumer prices up 2.2%, slightly higher than the 2% in February. While inflation remains close to the 2% target, the KDI warned that upward pressure could build further as the impact of rising oil prices is gradually reflected in inflation, which may act as a negative factor for future consumption. Exports are also at risk of facing worsening conditions amid a potential slowdown in external demand due to the Middle East war. Yoon-jin, Arirang News.
In the meantime, however, Samsung Electronics is marking a new milestone with its earnings for the first quarter of this year sharply surpassing expectations as global demand for AI chips outweigh fears over the economic fallout of the unrest in the Middle East. Our Lee Soo-jin reports.
Samsung Electronics' first quarter profit beat its total for all of last year. The company announced quarter-one profits of 57.2 trillion Korean won, or approximately $37.9 billion. This sets a new record for the highest quarterly operating profit in the company's history. According to the company's preliminary earnings report released Tuesday, the operating profit is a 755% surge compared to the same period in 2025. Sales reached 133 trillion won, or roughly $88.1 billion. That represents a 68% increase on year. This follows a record-breaking fourth quarter of 2025, which saw 20.1 trillion won in profit. With just the first quarter results of 2026, Samsung is already nearing its highest ever annual operating profit of 58.89 trillion won recorded during the semiconductor supercycle in 2018. While market analysis had widely expected a strong performance, the record-breaking figures even outpaced initial forecasts. This historic performance is underpinned by a semiconductor superboom. The primary driver is the explosive global demand for AI computing, which caused DRAM and NAND prices to surge by approximately 90% compared to the previous quarter. Securities analysis estimate that the semiconductor division's operating profit alone exceeded 50 trillion won, essentially driving the entire company's earnings. Specifically, they estimate that DRAM alone recorded over 41 trillion won in operating profit. Samsung's mobile and smartphone divisions also contribute to the bottom line, bolstered by the recent launch of Samsung's flagship AI-integrated handset series earlier this year. The finalized and fully audited financial results, including specific divisional performances, will be disclosed later this month following board approval. 이수진, Arirang News.
Now, while we await that disclosure, our economics correspondent Kim Do-yeon reached out to pundits for their thoughts on Samsung's latest performance and the prospects ahead. To take a listen.
Samsung Electronics' record-breaking first quarter performance has propelled the company into the global top 5 for tech sector profits, which includes Apple, Microsoft, and Alphabet. With memory chip prices climbing and sales heavily booked following February's rollout of next-generation HBM4 chips, financial experts are revising annual forecasts upward.
We also expect memory semiconductor prices to continue rising significantly in the second quarter, so this year's expected operating profit will likely exceed our previous estimates by a wide margin. We had projected an operating profit of around 240 trillion won, but we now expect it to reach even higher. I can tell you that the valuation merit is quite substantial.
The structural demand for AI infrastructure remains robust. Recently, the emergence of highly efficient software technologies such as TurboQuant sparked market concerns that major memory chip makers like Samsung and SK Hynix might struggle as overall hardware requirements decrease. However, experts note that this efficiency actually accelerates broader market expansion.
To summarize, software technologies that utilize less memory, such as Google's, allow software companies to use less memory while accelerating the growth of their inference business. This has the effect of allowing more companies to enter the market. Consequently, that means even more memory will be needed.
While the demand outlook remains exceptionally strong, the industry is also closely monitoring external geopolitical risks. However, Middle East tensions currently pose minimal threat to immediate operations despite the sector's reliance on regional materials like helium and LNG. Domestic chip makers have secured a 6-month stockpile, meaning broader macroeconomic fallout would be a much greater concern than chip production if Operation Epic Fury prolongs.
If the situation prolongs, semiconductor production itself won't be the issue. Rather, all industries that demand semiconductors will experience considerable difficulties. In that scenario, even if we manufacture the chips, there may be nowhere to sell them.
Furthermore, the weakened Korean won against the US dollar continues to bolster Samsung's earnings, providing a highly favorable environment for major exporters. With this currency trend expected to persist, the company's profitability is positioned for further growth. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news now, NASA's Artemis II astronauts have made history by setting a new distance record for traveling further from Earth than anyone before. Our Cho Young-eun covers that event.
Breaking into tears and hugging one another, the 4 astronauts marked the moment they set a new record for the farthest human spaceflight. On Monday, the Artemis II crew traveled 248,655 miles from Earth, surpassing the previous record set by Apollo 13 in 1970. Moments after the milestone, they proposed names for two lunar craters, Integrity after their Orion capsule, and Carol in honor of Commander Reed Wiseman's late wife. The Orion spacecraft launched successfully on April 1st from Kennedy Space Center in Florida aboard the Space Launch System rocket beginning its journey around the moon. As the astronauts became the first humans to view parts of the moon's far side in person, the crew temporarily lost contact with mission control during a planned 40-minute signal blackout while orbiting behind the moon. Contact was later restored and the crew went on to observe a solar eclipse.
So you'd been transported to the far side of the moon, and it really just bent your mind. It was an extraordinary human experience.
As Canadian astronaut Jeremy Henson confirmed that the crew had traveled farther than any humans in history, he also emphasized that the milestone should inspire future generations to make sure this record is not long-lived. At its farthest point, the spacecraft is expected to reach approximately 252,756 miles from Earth before returning home. As it passes the moon, the spacecraft measured within about 4,067 miles of the lunar surface. Now more than halfway through their 10-day mission, the crew is scheduled to splash down off the coast of San Diego on Friday, April 10. 조영은, Arirang News.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. Russian drones struck Ukraine's Black Sea port city of Odesa overnight on Monday, killing a 30-year-old mother, her 2-year-old daughter, and one other woman. Residential buildings, energy infrastructure, and a kindergarten were damaged in the attack. Odesa's regional governor said 16 people sustained injuries, including a pregnant woman and 2 small children. Around 16,700 households across several districts lost power, with the energy company saying repairs would take significant time. President Vladimir Zelensky said Russia launched 140 drones at Ukraine in overnight attacks, also striking energy infrastructure across the Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipro regions. Over the past week alone, Russia has attacked Ukraine with more than 2,800 attack drones, nearly 1,350 guided aerial bombs, and over 40 missiles. Zelensky renewed his call for additional air defense systems, saying Russia has no intention of stopping. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday handed Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon a significant legal victory, issuing an order that opens the door to the dismissal of his criminal contempt of Congress conviction. The justices set aside an appeals court decision that had kept Bannon's 2022 conviction intact, and with that appeal ruling now thrown out, a federal trial judge can proceed with the Trump administration's pending request to drop the case entirely. Bannon has already completed a 4-month prison term following his conviction for defying a subpoena from the House committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack. The Justice Department, which pursued the case under the Biden administration, abandoned its defense of the conviction after Trump took office for a second term. The head of the International Monetary Fund said on Monday that the war in the Middle East is set to push inflation higher and slow global growth, warning that even a swift end to hostilities will not prevent a downgrade to the IMF's economic outlook. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the conflict has reduced global oil supply by 13%, disrupting energy shipments and supply chains from helium to fertilizers. She said the deeper and longer the war runs, the greater the damage to growth and prices worldwide. The IMF releases its full World Economic Outlook on April 14th, where the war is expected to dominate discussions among global finance officials. Chu Ji-han, Arirang News.
Temperatures dropped quite a bit this morning, bringing a late-season cold snap. Tomorrow in Seoul, it'll fall to around 3 degrees Celsius. And it'll stay chilly in the mornings through tomorrow and on Wednesday. So make sure to bring a jacket when heading out. Meanwhile, air quality will be pretty good nationwide because of better air quality. In parts of the central and western regions, dust levels could tick up a bit in the morning and again at night as the air gets a little stagnant. But things should clear out in the afternoon. Tomorrow, we'll see large day-to-night temperature swings. Seoul will start the day at 3 degrees Celsius, Chuncheon at 0 degrees, Daegu at 1 degree. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 15 degrees, Chuncheon at 16 degrees, Busan at 15 degrees. Looking ahead, we've got more rain on the way from Thursday into Friday. It could be quite heavy at times, especially along the southern coast, around Jirisan Mountain and on Jeju Island. Once the rain clears, it'll warm up again. But with these ups and downs in the weather, make sure to take care of yourself. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session, so do stay with us and thank you for now.